see your smiling faces. So, okay, Gregory.
So thank you all for joining us. Today we have John DeVore, who is well known for his both beautifully physically speakers and in terms of how good they sound, that are all very, I guess is known for efficient speakers, which is pretty amazing speakers from the ones that I've heard. And so if you want to ask questions, we can do that in the chat. And John, if you're ready to go, take it away.
Great, thanks a lot. And thank you also for inviting me. This is it's fun. It's a cool way to come into the Brooklyn Navy Yard when it's completely quiet, sneak around with my cat and get some quality time. So I appreciate all this. I guess I'm not gonna start with, you know, I was born in Chicago in Michael Reese Hospital or anything. I guess when I graduated from art school in 1988, I went right to New York, and I think it was within the first couple of days, I was walking down Broadway, and I was already a pretty hardcore audiophile, and I'd already been building my own speakers. And I saw a hi-fi store that I was immediately intrigued by, and there was a help wanted sign in it. So I went in and applied for my first post-college job at Stereo Exchange and got it. And so that was my real first introduction into sort of the back end of our industry. You know, before that, I was always somebody who really couldn't afford almost any of the stuff in the hi-fi stores that I would frequent, and you know, more often than not, felt like an intruder or a time waster, tire kicker. All of a sudden, I was on the front lines on the other side, and it was amazing. It was incredible. It was really fun. Stereo Exchange back then was the mecca for high-end used gear. So really, we got to play me and all the guys who worked there. We got to play with all of the best gear. Everything would eventually come through there in New York City because people were always trading up. You know, getting the new latest and greatest and trading in the old latest and greatest. So yeah, it was an amazing experience, an amazing learning experience. But as sort of on what Greg was talking about with the higher efficiency, you know, late 80s and all through the 90s was a time, at least as far as I can see, it was a time in the hi-fi industry. It was kind of the end of a trend that had started in the 70s of speakers becoming much lower sensitivity, amplifiers increasing in power, and that trend really sort of came to a head at the end of the 80s and the 90s with speakers from various companies that had 1 ohm or less impedance moments, or sensitivities, 1 watt sensitivities, not voltage sensitivities, but 1 watt sensitivities of 80 dB or 82 dB, just, you know, really numbers that would be considered absurd 15 years prior to that. And since I was working in a store that had all of the newest stuff and all of the oldest stuff, I was in a almost unique position to be able to compare those really directly and listen to the way that the amplifiers would sound different on a pair of, say, you know, Teals or Wilsons that needed a ton of current, or a pair of Altecs, or a pair of Quads, or a pair, you know, just very different loads and sensitivities. And it was, you know, the years that I worked there were extremely educational, and it certainly directed my speaker designs that I was just doing as a hobby, or as little one-off consignments or studio monitors for friends who had very small time recording studios in the East Village. So my designs started to track a little bit with what I would hear comparing everything at the shop. And by the time the late 90s rolled around, I had a couple of designs that I thought were really successful and that did things that I wasn't hearing in the other speakers that we were selling. And I thought that there was a hole in the market for a normal looking speaker, the normal meaning, you know, not a giant horn speaker, but a slim tower or a small bookshelf speaker that was capable of being driven by low power tubes that were not tons and tons of parallel output devices, or that didn't have colossal output secondaries on their transformers with crazy winding ratios in order to drop the output impedance down, you know. So there was this, and at that moment, I was working at Sound by Singer, and a friend of mine who I knew in the industry, who I'd worked with briefly at Stereo Exchange, opened up in his living room in Brooklyn, decided to start selling reconstructed vintage tube integrated amps. So these are these beautiful little like Sherwoods and Scotts and all these various, you know, Pilot. There was a lot of these Icos, and they were beautiful sounding little amps, just these gorgeous. They all had single pairs of output tubes. They could be EL84s, they could be 6L6s for some of the bigger ones. You know, they varied quite a bit. And they had beautiful, it was sort of the heyday of the sort of first wave of tube amp design. You know, they all had some negative feedback, but not a ton. And they were designed for speakers that were 8 to 16 ohms. And so he was selling these things, but he didn't want to sell the appropriate speakers because, you know, somebody that wanted this beautiful gem-like little integrated amp in their house is not necessarily in New York City, at least, going to have room for a pair of Altec Valencias or a pair of Tannoy 15 Reds, you know, in their house. Those are huge cabinets. And so I started building one-offs and two-offs of small speakers, little, you know, 7-inch two-ways, but that had very kind impedances for these amps. And it sounded wonderful. And that guy, Steve Michaud, ended up within a year, within 6 months, he opened a storefront in Manhattan called In Living Stereo, which is still there. And he was my first actual dealer. And when he opened that walk-in retail shop with legitimate brands, you know, name, and I think whatever, he had actual brand names in there, I realized that I needed to really up my game and get consistent products, you know, rather than building, you know, oh, my customer needs this, my customer needs a pair of these, can you make them yellow? All of a sudden I needed to have a coherent product line. And so I designed 2 speakers. There was the original Gibbon 3 and the Gibbon 8, which was the floor standing. And that was it. That was the beginning of it officially. And I was still actually working part-time at Sound by Singer. So I had to hide the fact that I had a speaker company from Andy Singer, which was a little nerve-wracking, I must say. And then about probably after, you know, maybe 5 months of doing that, and the brand was called DeVore Fidelity, but it was so tiny and it was only one store that I wasn't worried about anyone finding out. But then I realized that if Andy found out without me telling him, he'd be pissed, and Andy pissed is not good. So I took him out for martinis after work one day, a few months after all this had been going on, and handed him one of my product brochures. And he took a long sip from his martini, and he looked at me and he was like, "You started a fucking speaker company and you didn't tell me?" So he became my second dealer. And I changed my business cards there from John DeVore to John Leonard, my middle name, just so that it wasn't weird selling my own speakers. And it was still too weird, and I hated it. It made me very uncomfortable. And so that only lasted for about a month, and that was it. I was full-time as a speaker designer and manufacturer. That was 2001. Do we want to break for any questions, or should I just keep going? Is there anything in particular that people want me to focus on? I mean, that's chapter 1, I guess.
So one of the questions that I think might be good to touch on is matching, and I think you talked about it a little bit, but matching amps and speakers, and what are the critical factors there?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was a big reason for me feeling like I had a legitimate reason to start a speaker company of my own. So when I was doing all those experiments with, handfuls of amps and handfuls of speakers, I could hear the way that it was obviously different combinations sounding different. But it wasn't because this, a lot of people sort of think about a hi-fi system. I mean, people with a lot of experience putting systems together don't particularly, but it's easy to imagine that a hi-fi system's sound is 90% dictated by the speakers. And then all the rest is just kind of like getting the speakers to sound as good as they can. And I sort of started to approach it, and Ivor Turfenbaum would get up from his grave and slap me in the face for saying that. But at this, I started to realize that that amplifiers could sound much better or much worse based on what they're being asked to drive and whether or not that's an appropriate load for that amp. And so on a pair of 16 ohm speakers with a sensitivity of 100 dB per watt per meter, or at 1 watt at 1 meter, there were a lot of amps that sounded terrible. And I think over the years, it was easy to sort of write off those speakers as sounding terrible. But then you could get those speakers to sound fantastic on other amps. And that's not because, an Altec needs to have some sort of a crappy measuring, very rolled off, ultra warm sounding tube amp in order to sound good. What's actually happening is the load of that Altec with its 16 ohm load and very high sensitivity is actually allowing that otherwise maybe poorly measuring tube amp to actually measure and output very low distortion and much more linear response, because it's doing what it was more intentionally designed to do. That amp, a little Sherwood integrated amp, or let's say an amplifier with a single pair of push-pull EL34s from back then with peerless transformers and all that. The designer of that circuit would never even imagine a speaker load like a Watt Puppy 5.1 or a pair of Teal CS5s. It would never occur to them that anyone would design a speaker that was that impossible to drive for whatever the current amplifier technology was in 1960 or whatever, whenever this theoretical designer was designing. So hearing and vice versa, I would hear solid state amps that would sound just fine driving Apogee Scintillas sound really sort of mediocre driving a vintage pair of, let's say, Rogers Studio Ones or something like that. That is, it's a very different kind of a load. So so those first speaker designs, the Gibbon 8, the little Gibbon 3s, so following that we had Silverbacks and Super 8s and 9s. All of those speakers were very, very flat, low reactance 8 ohm loads. And I kept on finding that amplifier after amplifier after amplifier would sound better on those speakers. It was almost like was almost like cheating the system. Like my speakers may or may not sound better, but if the whole system sounds better because the amplifier sounds way better, and you could use these really beautiful little amplifiers that had a lot of magic to them, but that maybe were limited in their current output, or were higher than normal output impedance. You know, I was kind of like opening up a whole type of system to a lot of people who wouldn't be able to put a big single driver open baffle speaker in their room or something like that. So yes, so the matching, and it goes both ways. It's not, you know, a higher impedance, higher sensitivity speaker is not always going to make that amplifier sound better. You know, as my designs went on and the orangutan series came out a dozen or so years ago, as I was designing those were intended to be higher impedance than 8 ohms and higher sensitivity than the generally sort of 90 dB that I had been hovering around for all the Gibbon and Silverback stuff. And so I started realizing that what I had sort of learned 10 years prior to that, it was a re-education that still rang true, and that there were even more amps that sounded better on the 12 ohm high sensitivity load, but there were also even more amps that sounded worse on that 12 ohm high sensitivity load. You know, for example, let's just take an easy example actually that I discovered recently, 2 John Curl designs. I had for many years as one of my high power reference amps here at the factory. I had a Parasound A21. Loved it. It was a fantastic amp. Is a fantastic amp. Had that for years, and that it was, I would say, more than any other amp like it. It became my long-term high power, big current reference amp. And then a few years ago, I swapped that for the newer JC5 from Parasound, which was touted to be basically John Curl's ultimate stereo amp, the best he was going to be able to do within the constraints of Parasound and within the constraints of having 2 channels on 1 chassis. And so I was like, fuck, no brainer. So I got one of those, and I discovered that unlike the A21, it didn't sound nearly as good into the higher impedance speakers as it did into the lower impedance speakers. And so my lowest impedance speakers, currently Gibbon's Super 9s, which dropped down to about 5.5 ohms in the bass, they were by far the best match for the JC5. And the O-Refs behind me, or the O96s, the amplifier tended to sound kind of bland and grayish and unimpressive. And I had heard that many times before, but this was the first kind of back-to-back, same designer, same company, really sort of same idea behind the amplifier itself. And it was a revelation. It was kind of amazing. You know, I would say maybe it sounded better on the Super 9 than the A21 did, but the A21 sounded more better on the O96s than the JC5 did. There was a bigger difference into the higher impedance loads.
What's the reasoning for that?
You'd have to ask John Curl. I mean, you know, my explanation of it, and I've heard this in speaker cables as well. And I had a long conversation with Garth from AudioQuest about this too, because I was, sorry, sidetrack. My explanation of it is that the designers don't have loads anything like what the orangutans are, for example. You know, nobody's got a pair, you know, if they're going to have a weird load around, they may have a pair of 16 ohm LS35As or a pair of quads. But the vast majority, and you know, if you look at people's kind of test systems and stuff like that for cable companies or amplifier companies, you see, you know, Wilson, Magico, maybe Rockport. You know, you see a lot of very well established, excellent high-end speakers. Not a single one of which could be even really considered. Some of them are borderline 8 ohm loads, but for the most part, they're 4 ohm and mostly have significant issues with even being a 4 ohm speaker. And so it makes sense that these products that get designed and fine-tuned on a system like that, it makes sense that they would be optimized for that. It's not surprising in the least. And Garth agreed. He was, a few years ago when I decided I had to start a secondary project with an amplifier company, I thought that it would make sense for me to get a broader sense of some favorite speaker cables, because people are always asking me, what speaker cables do I recommend on my speakers? And I'll defer to the dealers for the most part, just because they've got so much more experience swapping in and out cables. I've had some over the years. I mean, I have a couple of different pairs that I've had at the office here for a million years, but I do have some exposure at hi-fi shows every once in a while, sort of partnering with a speaker company, a cable company. And once at a Capital Audio Fest, I was collaborating with a dealer down there, and it was a group of us. So it was Nick Doshi brought in the electronics, I brought in the speakers. Jeff Fox brought in the turntable that he was importing at that point, and the speaker cables were from Transparent. And Transparent, with their network, they are tuning their speakers for very specific loads, both from the amplifier end. They have, the higher up in their line you go, the more specific they get, and they have cables that are tuned for tube amps and for solid state amps. And I was having a lot of trouble getting the system dialed in the night before the show was going to open. And so Jeff Fox brought in a different pair of transparent cables that were less expensive, but were more suitable for the amps, the Doshi amps and the Super 9 speakers. And boom, like that, it was like I dialed in the system. It was just that was it. It was like I couldn't move the room treatment and move the positions of the speakers in the listening position around enough to compensate for the fact that that speaker cable was it was seeing the wrong load in that room. So yeah, I mean, it's clear as day that, and Transparent on their part, they're aware of it and are tuning their high-end cables to be really specific for these specific loads. And I commend them for that. And Garth also, when I'd heard a couple of different audio quests in the system when I was evaluating a bunch of cables. And I have to say, there were several companies where all of their stuff, if I did cable comparisons on given Super 9s, they may come out in the top 1 or 2 favorites, but would end up at the absolute bottom of the list on the 096s every time. It was clear that whatever the designers were doing in there, it was working for those lower impedance loads, but what was a real problem for the higher impedance loads. But the AudioQuest was one of the few brands that were coming out sounding very balanced, having a similar sound in the high impedance and in the low impedance stuff. And so I ended up actually getting a set of Thunderbird from them as one of the new in rotation in the system.
Have you tried measuring the impedances of these cables to try to understand what's going on from a circuit's point of view?
Yeah, I have a 6 meter length. It's not the impedance. It's nothing that I'm measuring here. There are parameters, obviously, every chunk of wire has, has a set of measurements, an LCR, and, all of those things are measurable, and they're all going to be different. One, and they tend to be in ratio. So L goes up, C comes down, vice versa. Like a name or a LIN cable is going to have an LCR that is very different from an AudioQuest cable or something like that, because of the nature of the amplifiers that they're designed to work with. So, but yeah, no, it didn't necessarily hold true to measurements that I was doing. And I wasn't going deep because, I had a bunch of free cables to borrow to kind of come up with ones that I wanted to keep. So I wasn't going to try to, and I had a million other projects. This was around the same point where I was trying to get the 20 finalized, like, a year and a half ago or something like that. And I had driver prototypes coming in and out for the O babies and stuff like that, which only just recently came out. So yeah, it wasn't my interest to, one of my things that I hated the most, and I talked to several of the wire companies about this, is like, essentially I was dreading comparing speaker cables. I found that to be something that I was trying to avoid like the plague. And I really had no interest in doing it, but it needed to be done, and I did it for a while, and it was very interesting, actually. Not enjoyable though.
Very interesting. One of the questions, what crossover alignments do you use in addition to crossing over? Do you impedance match or flattening with crossovers?
So the design of my speakers, so a lot of the correction networks and things like that you can put in a passive network, they are just exactly what they're saying. They're correction networks. And so they're based on the idea that you can correct a flaw with something in the speaker system, whether it's a bad resonance or a peak. Maybe it's a resonance where the diaphragm, the membrane, connects to the surround. There's a lot of peaks and resonances at those frequencies. So then the idea is that to correct that problem, you add an opposite problem to the crossover network. And that I ruled that out about 5 years before I started the company.
So actually, I was wondering, so a lot of your emphasis has been on making a nice impedance for amplifiers to drive. So
yes,
one of the
but not
things
with the
that
correction circuit. Yeah, no,
one
not
of the things that I can do with the crossover network is not particularly modifying the efficiency of the loudspeaker, but flattening the impedance. But you
Right.
don't do that.
No.
Okay.
No.
And so then what alignments do you use?
They're hybrids. They're not. They are definitely not textbook. And I attribute that to, I started designing speakers in the 80s, at least before I had any remote access to software crossover design. So the crossovers were done with a calculator and a paper and pencil, including fourth order Linkwitz-Riley crossovers, which I did a few of those as well. And so you get it all done on paper, and then you build it, and it sounds nothing like what you were hoping. And then you get in there and you start replacing components, and you start modifying and hybridizing immediately, and trying to improve things. And then over decades of doing that, and starting with textbook circuits, Bessels and Butterworths and LRs and series and parallel, and I sort of got a sense of and all of this. I mean, I don't frankly, if I was starting out today, and I just went out and bought, LoudSoft, speaker measurement package, or, some of these amazing tools that are available today. None of this, I don't know how much of this would be relevant, but so what I ended up having, so I sort of came up with these circuits of my own that were working over and over and over. And that's what all of the products, essentially everything that has ever been built under DeVore Fidelity banner has used some variant of these weird hybrid circuits that I came up with, sometime in the early 90s, and kind of fine-tuned as I was just building purely for fun up until I started the company.
Okay, so specifically you're using the weird alignment.
I'm using the weird alignment. Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, they're not, the slopes vary to some extent. So I wasn't exactly sure. I had ideas about what they were, but I wasn't exactly sure until I got back around when I started the company. I bought the Linear X system, which is a computer card based measurement and test tone generation. And then Chris also had a package of like enclosure modeling and crossover simulation modeling. And so I got all that stuff, and I started working, and of course, the box modeling wizard or the crossover modeling wizard is suggesting, you say, I want a third order at this frequency point, and I don't want the crossover, I don't want the impedance of the network to dip down below enter X, 6 ohms, and it's gonna spit out third order Butterworth, or it's gonna spit out whatever you decided to enter in. So I had to sneak in the back door of the software and start sort of building the networks. So what I would do is I would virtually build the networks. I would virtually enter in drivers from speakers that I had built years ago, and then enter in the networks and see what the computer thought it was gonna do, and then sort of retrain the computer, because I could then, at this point, I was able to measure those old designs. And so I had to essentially teach the software, that those simulation programs, I had to sort of teach myself and the programs how to interpret what it was doing. And so that all became kind of the language that allowed me to design far better. I mean, it gave me it was a lot less guesswork, essentially, for the speaker designs that went on from there. So the original Gibbon 3 and the original Gibbon 8 were designed before I had that system figured out at all. Those were released into the world with their crossovers based on pencil and paper calculations, and based on, in like 3 different rooms listening and fine-tuning, essentially. And then using those and a few earlier designs, kind of teaching myself how the software was understanding my circuits, and then moving forward from there. And it was amazing. It was a revelation. The first version of the Gibbon 3 had a couple of clear mistakes that I could see in the measurement, and that actually one keen-eared friend of mine had noticed and pointed out to me, and then I heard, but I was confirmed with measurements, and I was able to correct it with just a slight adjustment in the values of the crossover, but also that the original Gibbon 8s had a great design, and that circuit stayed for the entire life of the Gibbon 8 for years on, even after I had the far more sophisticated tools available to me. but I never would have been able to design the Silverbacks if I didn't have that Linear X gear and really understood it and had, you know, it had lived with my crossover, my weird ass circuits, and I had figured out how to interpret what it was telling me about my weird ass circuits. There's no way I would have been able to do the Silverbacks at that point.
Thank you.
We've got another question here. Can you comment on the state of the industry as well as your company in particular?
State of the industry. So I have only really been in the industry since I started working in retail at the very tail end of the 80s. And when I got into the New York hi-fi retail scene in 1988, and all of the old timers, all they could talk about was how amazing it was in the mid 80s. It was like the glory days, and the store owners were in the back doing blow with their best customers, and nobody could keep anything in stock, and people were pre-ordering the most expensive things that anyone had ever conceived of in the history of hi-fi, and it was the glory days. And here I was in 1988 having missed that. And, you know, whatever, I'm not going to argue with it. Sure, okay. And then from there on, it was all downhill for high-end audio retail, I think. I think the rise of the internet from that moment on hurt everything. It hurt Stereo Exchange specifically. I could see it hurting Stereo Exchange in it becoming much less an exclusive place to buy used high-end audio. All of a sudden there was audio gone, and this place, you know, Stereo Exchange being this place to visit for tourists from all over the world to come and see all the awesome used gear. All of a sudden people could just stare at their computer screens and scroll through, again, like a wall of awesome used hi-fi gear, and they could be like, oh wow, you know, there's a Krell KSA 80, you know, and I could buy it and it can get shipped right to my door. I don't have to go anywhere. I don't have to cut myself on the sharp heat sinks trying to get it out of the shelf in Stereo Exchange. So yeah, it was a tough time, but being a tough time for the stores is different from the industry itself not doing well. I think the industry itself did fine. It was doing okay. It was changing. I think what I was reading about the industry at the end of the 90s that convinced me to start my company, this whole idea that this unsustainable idea of speakers getting more and more difficult to drive and amplifiers needing to be more and more brutal or having more and more negative feedback was an unsustainable trend, and it would eventually, you know, there's still that, there is part of the market still has that, but there's also a huge part of the market now for speakers that are not impossible to drive, certainly speakers that are higher sensitivity. Even if they may be 4-ohm speakers, they're higher sensitivity than they ever used to be. Analog and vacuum tubes came back in a big way. I mean, you know, nobody ever suspected there to be as many turntable manufacturers as there are now back in 1996 or 1999. So I think currently the state of the industry is healthy. It's okay. It's good. I think there's a lot of still struggling to figure out market sort of business plans for market penetration. I think it's easier to be a company, a manufacturer that has direct sales now than it ever has been. And there are a lot of very successful operations doing that. You know, a funny example is Zoo, like Zoo Audio, the Zoo speakers. You know, Sean and his partner, they were originally a direct to consumer brand, and then at some point in the 2000s they decided that they were going to go through I guess they were bought, or maybe there was an investor. I don't remember exactly what the details were, but they decided they were going to go through a dealer network, and they started painstakingly building a dealer network. And of course, that meant that their prices had to go up. And then they had these weird legacy products, and it was complicated. And I think it almost tanked them. And they basically got rid of all that, and they started from scratch, and they are back to being, from as far as I know, back to being a healthy, well-run, direct-to-consumers speaker company. So, there are very legitimate ways to do business now as a manufacturer that didn't exist before. And there are legitimate ways to be a dealer now. You can be an online dealer and be legitimate. It used to be, if you were an online dealer, you were only selling mid-fi stuff, or you were only selling at a huge discount in order to basically have, you would have to sort of siphon off, the bottom feeders of the consumer market from the brick and mortar shops. And that's not the case anymore. Now there are legitimate high-end retailers online that, have reasonable return policies, or maybe they have a system in place where they can hire somebody local to you to come and set up their turntable, with that kind of a thing. So, so the market is adapting for sure. I feel like in the 20-something years that I've been in business, I have gone from sort of a revolutionary young gun to a stodgy traditionalist, and that I still only sell through my brick and mortar dealer network. But it's working for me. So how is DeVore Fidelity doing? We're doing great. We've been outgrown here in the Navy Yard. We have outgrown our place. We did so a few years ago. But we haven't wanted to move out of the Navy Yard. Hi, this is everyone. This is Roxy. We haven't wanted to move out of the Navy Yard. The Brooklyn Navy Yard it's an industrial park. It was where battleships were built for many, many decades. And in the 80s, rather gradually, it was converted to an industrial park. And with the mission of bringing manufacturing back to New York City, to Brooklyn. And so we feel very at home here. We love it. We love it here. Anthony, who runs Box Furniture Company and also who builds all of my cabinets, we love being here in the Navy Yard. So, so we have been agitating for more space here in the Navy Yard, and this or last year, 2022, we finally have gotten more space. So we are currently shipping 096 orders that were ordered 1 year ago, and we are back ordered out another year into the future on that model. The 096 is our most popular speaker, and that's not sustainable. I mean, obviously, it's nice to be in that position, but it's also very stressful. It absolutely sucks for my dealer network, and it sucks for customers. Customers with undying patience are losing it, and demanding their refunds, and that sucks for the store, because the store is losing a sale, and hopefully maybe selling on to something that will not take so long to get. It sucks for the customer not being able to get what they really wanted. And so we have expanded. We're going to almost double our footprint here in the Brooklyn Navy Yard over the next several months. And I have, as of last week, I have doubled my staff. So my sort of section of things. So DeVore Fidelity and Box Furniture are, sort of have a space that's divided into thirds. So my third contains this office here, and then the area where all of the final assembly is done, crossovers are all built, all the packing, shipping, everything like that is done. It's sort of the non-dusty area. And so I've had for years, I've had 2 assembly tables and all of that. So I now have 3 assembly tables, and I'm working on the 4th. And I have twice the staff for doing just that part of it. And then Box Furniture, who has the other 2/3 of this big loft with woodshop stuff, with big, beautiful computerized sliding table saws and planers and on all that kind of stuff. He has also doubled his staff, but we are out of space. Being a retail, a wood shop space, you need space for lumber, you need space for machines, things like that. But once you move into being a manufacturer who is selling retail, selling things that go to customers, there's also a huge number of bulky items. So there's packaging material. Here in Brooklyn, we're paying, our square footage place, what we pay per square foot here for the factory is, I'm sure, many times more expensive than what most of the country is paying for street front retail leases. So, so space is very valuable here. So we've got these huge pallet shelves that go up to the ceilings and stuff like that for all of the cardboard and all of the custom boxes and the packaging material and all that kind of stuff. So we've been wanting to expand, but we've been very, very careful not to bite off more than we can chew. And at this point, being a year back ordered, it is definitely time to take a big bite. So yeah, so long story short, we're doubling our footprint. I'm going to be able to add a few more assembly tables, and Anthony's going to be able to efficiently expand his production. And we are hoping by the end of this year to be able to dig out of our absurd backorder situation and become definitely, more streamlined and more smoothly run. So business is good, and but we are struggling in a way because of it. Just because of the way that I've grown the company very slowly, very deliberately. I have fired far more dealers than I've hired. I have a tiny but wonderful dealer network. And I don't want to ever build speakers in a way other than we do currently today, absolutely 100% by hand, checking everything 5 times, and all of that hand assembly, checking all the seams, and making sure that I still listen to every single pair of speakers that goes out with a mono signal, listening to them, making sure that everything is wired in phase, making sure that all the drivers are working, and that's fine with me. I want to do that forever. That's the way I want our speakers to be built. So it's been a very slow process and very careful, cautious process.
So we have a number of more questions, so I'll throw a couple together here. Yep. One is, what are the design and build implications for creating higher impedance and efficiency designs? And also, do speaker and wire manufacturers take RF properties into account when designing products?
Well, I'll answer the second one first because I'm not really going to answer it. I mean, RF properties are part of the design no matter what, automatically. And if it's got horrible RF performance, it's going to affect the output of, it's going to affect the sound. That may or may not be part of why, doing large impedance changes at either end of the cable. It certainly could be part of the effect that is making a cable sound better or worse. I remember years ago when I first started working at Stereo Exchange, this young upstart little punk cable designer named Ray Kimber was driving around the country in an RV, and he would come in and he would demonstrate his cables. And so he would bring his cheapest cable that was like the 4PR at that point. It was 4 positive, 4 negative with his woven braid. And he would tell us to go and get all of our most expensive and all of our favorite speaker cables, whether or not they were the same. And he would set up an oscilloscope, and he would set it up in the system, and he would measure. You could see on the oscilloscope how much RF was getting into the signal. And his, you know, his braided, naturally RF rejecting braid would always win, you know? So, so yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm sure there's a million speaker cable, you know, there's a million speaker cable companies out there, and there's a percentage of them that are clueless, that don't know anything, that are selling a sham. It's maybe not a huge percentage. There's a million amplifier companies and a million speaker companies out there. And a percentage of those, maybe the same percentage across the board, are clueless and they're scammers, or they just really literally don't know any better, and they're just like, this is my great design, and they've never heard anything else, and they're just selling it. Whatever. I mean, so as far as do all cable designers take RF into consideration, the answer is clearly no. But I'm guessing that the best ones all are, they do, you know, I mean, it's definitely, you know, it's part of the limited suite that they have available to them, you know, at least compared to an amp designer where there are so many other variables that they can play with. What was the first part of that question? Oh, what makes a speaker design higher sensitivity? So one of the things that I did during COVID, I started a DeVore Fidelity YouTube channel, and if I look at the statistics of all of the videos, they're like, you know, 800 views up to like 2.5K, you know, maybe there's a 30K views. There's a few that have 25K views. You know, it's all like that, all like that. And then there's one that has hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views. That video is, I don't remember what I called it. It's called The Rant. And it's literally, I talk about all this stuff that I was thinking about before I started the company. And it's sort of like the lowering of sensitivity and the lowering of impedance of speaker designs and the demands that those designs were putting on amplifiers of the day, all through, starting in the 70s, all through the 80s and into the 90s. And the rant talked about a specific specification. So the speaker sensitivity specification, originally, and it's you know, it's not specifically codified anywhere, but way back in the day, 20s, 30s, the sensitivity was actually expressed in a efficiency. It was a percentage of efficiency up to 100%. No speakers were ever 100%. There's always a ton of waste going into heat. But big Western Electrics, these are speakers with a sensitivity of over 100 dB. These had they had efficiency specifications of 50%, 60%. You know, they had they had meaningful efficiency specifications. Gradually, what they moved over to as the impedance started to become normalized. So the Western Electric systems often were 24 ohms, then they would sort of be like 16 ohms, and then 16 ohms sort of became an industry standard. And so they started to express this efficiency in terms of sensitivity. And the sensitivity was how many dB would the system play measured from 1 meter back when you input 1 watt. So the 1 watt of power went into the speaker as measured at the terminals, and the sensor, the microphone generally, was placed at 1 meter away from the system as a whole, and that was a dB measurement. And so the wattage was assumed into 16 or 8 ohms. And so this meant that into that the wattage that was going into different loads would be the amplifiers would be just outputting that number of watts. So you would adjust the output of the amplifier so that 1 watt was measured at the terminals. And then this started to become a little bit more complex as the speaker designs got more complex, 3 ways, 4 ways, more compensation networks. And what this made the impedance loads of all these speakers a lot more variable. And that meant that if you took a sensitivity measurement from a test tone that was 1K or was 100 Hertz, you could actually get very, very different amounts of power into that speaker if you were adjusting for 1 watt. And that was because if the impedance was very different, you would be adjusting the amount of power that was going into the speaker load. So there became sort of a sister way of expressing this, and that is with voltage. So if you have an 8 ohm speaker and you put 1 watt into that 8 ohm speaker and you measure the voltage going into that speaker, you're getting 2.83 volts into that speaker. If you are putting, if you have a 4 ohm speaker, 2.83 volts is actually 2 watts. So if you're, what started happening is companies that, the speaker companies and actually the speaker driver companies as well, they started, as their product started to lower in sensitivity, they were harder to drive and lower in impedance. They realized that by expressing the efficiency of their speakers using voltage looked way better on paper than in wattage. So you could have a pair of speakers that their voltage sensitivity could be 90 dB, but their wattage sensitivity would actually be 84 dB, which is way worse looking, way worse looking. And so my rant was essentially that. It was, these are not equivalent, and they're not even equivalent. So this idea that, that an amplifier is going to automatically put 2.83 volts into 1 ohm just as easily it's going to put 2.83 volts into 16 ohms, even though there's many, many times more power. I mean, what is that? 1, so that's 2 watts, 4 watts, 8 watts, 16 watts. It's more than 16 times difference in how much power is required to get the same level of output. So this kind of, it was sort of like a scam. It's a lie, even though it's true. You know, it's like, it's, and this idea that a tube amplifier is going to be able to do what that sensitivity spec is claiming that it should be able to do. A 100-watt tube amplifier or a 50-watt tube amplifier should be able to easily drive a speaker that's rated at 90 dB sensitivity. But if that sensitivity is looking at a 1 ohm load in voltage, that 50-watt tube amp is absolutely not going to work. So the rant was about that. Wow, where was this going? Oh, so making a speaker that's easier to drive and is higher sensitivity is not just making a speaker that is higher sensitivity. It's making a speaker that's higher sensitivity and it is an easier load for the amplifier to drive. You can get a really, really high sensitivity speaker that's a brutal load, and sure, with a kilowatt of massive high feedback amplifiers in there, you're going to get ungodly amounts of sound out of it, and a lot of pro audio kind of prescribes to that kind of a setup. But it sounds awful. And there are very, very great sounding high-end audio systems that are brutally difficult to drive. So you just need to make sure that you've got these, colossal amplifiers that are going to work. And they could be tube amplifiers. I mean, there's Audio Research and VTL amplifiers that absolutely can drive these brutal loads really beautifully. But you just have to make sure that you've got that kind of a thing, and you can't be fooled by these sort of sensitivity specifications. So yeah, so my experience, so this whole concept of DeVore fidelity being very easy to drive got supercharged in around 2010 when I started working on the orangutans. The very first 096 was the first orangutan model to come out. And I started to realize, so I already had a reputation. The company had a reputation of being very easy to drive. People loved using tube amplifiers on all of the various Gibbons and Silverbacks out there. But I thought it would be fun to come out with something that was less universal. I mean, I had always stuck to 8 ohms because it is relatively universal. 8 ohms is friendly to the tube amplifier side and is friendly to the solid state amplifier side, because even though it wasn't necessarily a strictly followed standard load, it was still sort of a standard load. And any amplifier company worth anything is going to be testing into a regular old 8 ohm pair of speakers. And so it was very safe to release 8 ohm speakers. And so I tried to make them as high sensitivity as possible, maintaining an 8 ohm level. And the Silverback is sort of the ultimate expression of that. It is a really, really flat 8 ohm load with no correction whatsoever. And it is a real, it's a above 90 dB sensitivity in wattage load all the way across. And so a lot of people were using those with single-ended 300Bs and stuff like that. But with the Orangutan project, I wanted to push that further, and I wanted to walk away a little bit from this sort of being universal and sort of turn my back on the most aggressive solid-state amplifier designs, really those amplifiers that were really optimized for very difficult loads, and embrace more of those single-ended designs. And a single-ended tube amp, and a single, for that matter, a single-ended solid-state amp, unless it's got gobs of feedback on it, they're going to have much, much higher output impedance than push-pull amps or amplifiers that have massive parallel devices in the outputs. And so to make those sound better and to make those work better and to give those much more linear sounding output response, they like a higher impedance load, like a 16 ohm, like a classic 16 ohm speaker. I didn't want to go that far. I didn't want to make them 16 ohms, but I made them basically 10 and 12 ohm loads. The 096 is really a 12 ohm load. 093 is about 10 ohms. The OREFs are a little above 12 ohms. So that project, I wanted to also push the sensitivity spec, and I realized that to do that and to keep the impedances high and to keep them flea watt amp friendly, it was going to require the mid-bass drivers to grow in size. I could no longer use 6.5 inch bass mids anymore. There was just no way to get the sensitivity out of that without like having to go to that sort of low impedance, high voltage sensitivity. It's the only way really to do that. So yeah, at that point, once I realized that it had to be a 10-inch driver, so it was going to be a 10-inch two-way. So that necessitated a bigger tweeter than I had been using. All of the previous designs used a 3/4 inch dome tweeter. So that necessitated going to a larger, a 1 1/8 inch dome tweeter and a larger woofer. So that's kind of how that got sketched out. And what that also did is it pushed all my previous designs had been more contemporary high-end audio, which is the narrow profile column speaker, and any drivers that didn't fit on that narrow profile were moved to the sides. In the case of the Silverback or the original 9s, they had side-mounted woofers. And with the bass mid-range, you can't do that. The bass mid-range still has to be front firing. So that meant that I was no longer going to have these sort of narrow profile speakers. And so exploring that also taught me a lot about how the shape of the box expresses itself in sensitivity. So now we're not necessarily talking about that specific watt at a meter sensitivity spec that's measured literally at a meter, but in terms of a room sensitivity specification, what you're doing when you increase the size, the width of that front baffle, if you increase the size of the plane that those drivers are launching their sound out of, you're increasing room sensitivity and directionality in a few very important ways that, while they don't measure, certain of these measure and certain of these don't really measure easily, but in room they make a big difference. So the one that measures and has a big in-room noticeable effect is the step response. And so the step response of a speaker is that it's the frequency response where the sound waves, I mean, it's gonna get a little bit more technical, but essentially when the sound waves coming out of a driver in free space, let's start with, when the sound waves become as wide as the diaphragm. So let's start from the highest sound frequency waves are very, very small. The lowest are very, very large, and they increase in size they double in size with each octave down in frequency they go. And so if you have a driver of a certain size, the highest frequencies that it can reproduce are going to be narrower, they're going to be smaller than the width of the driver itself. And so those frequencies tend to beam straight out. They don't really have a very wide dispersion. And different things about the shape of the whatever the driver is can have some effect, but for the most part, those get sent, the vast majority of the energy from that frequency from that driver is sent forward. And as the frequency wavelength gets wider and wider, and as it gets wider than that driver, more and more of that energy that's coming off of the driver is actually going off to the sides, to a point where the driver actually almost becomes omnidirectional. And so it's whatever the measurable amount of energy coming off of that driver is being distributed through almost 360 degrees. So a much, much smaller amount of energy is actually going straight forward, because that all of the energy from that driver is going all over the place. So the step response refers to the speaker's system. So now we're talking about the drivers in a cabinet, and that cabinet has a dimension. And so now we're talking about the dimension of the wavelength where the edges of the box start to come into play. So wavelengths that are smaller than the dimension of the smallest dimension of that front of that speaker are all mostly moving forward in the room. So you're getting a higher percentage of direct energy compared to stuff going off to the sides and getting lost, whether it's getting absorbed or whether it's getting reflected or whatever it is. And as that, it's the same as what happens with the drivers. As that frequency increases in wavelength, gradually more and more of that energy wraps around the cabinet, and less of that energy percentage-wise is coming straight out. And the step response is that notch in the response where it goes from the high frequencies to the low frequencies. You can measure in every speaker, you can measure where that response essentially dips down and becomes more omnidirectional, or it becomes less directional. So it's more, you get essentially you get higher sensitivity, and then it drops down in sensitivity below that step response measurement. So when you make a big, wide speaker, you push that step response down a lot. And the difference in width between an 096 and a given Super 8 or a given 88 is big. I mean, it's more than an octave difference. And so you've got an additional increase in sensitivity of several dB measurable for a more than an octave more energy out into the room. And so when you're designing, when you're designing a speaker, most designers take this into consideration. I certainly do. You're designing the speaker to sound right, taking into consideration its step response. So you're tuning the response of everything, considering the step response. So I'm allowed, with a wider baffle, I'm allowed to not have to worry about where that step response is going to take away sensitivity until a much lower frequency. So all of these things kind of play into the real world ease of driving, a sense of real world efficiency of a speaker system in the real world. And it was amazing. I mean, it was a trip. It was a great learning experience digging into those first orangutan designs. I mean, it was over 5 years before the first one actually came to market as a product, because there was a big learning curve there for me. And it's amazing. I've had a blast doing it. We were sold all through the 90s on this idea that a high-end speaker had to be narrow, because a high-end speaker had to be narrow, otherwise it would not image. It was a fact, but it wasn't a fact. It was a sales brochure. And I was part of that. I mean, I was on the front lines selling that shit, and the manufacturers were selling it to us, and we were selling it to the customers. And I didn't realize that it was largely marketing until. So when I first started selling speakers at Stereo Exchange in 1988, one of the lines that we sold was Boston Acoustics, and the Boston Acoustics line that we were selling in the late 80s, early 90s, it was the A series. So it was the A70, A100, A150, and these were beautiful, wide. They were wider than they were deep, and they were, I guess you could say, oh, there's a cat. We got cats on here. They were old-fashioned cabinet layouts. And they tended to be like the A100 was a two-way with a 10-inch paper woofer, and it sounded phenomenal. We sold tons of those. They were great sounding speakers. And then sometime in the early 90s, Boston Acoustics, they were a big, powerful company back then. They did a big ad campaign, and they were promoting the A series was being replaced by the T series, T for tower. And they were all going narrow, and the two-way speaker now had to make do with a pair of 6.5-inch woofers and a tweeter instead of that one 10-inch woofer. And impedances dropped, sensitivity dropped, and I swear to God, they did not sound as good, and they were harder to sell. There were certain customers that would just come in and love them, and for the money, they were still great. I mean, they were still the best thing we had for the money there, no question. But they were not, I didn't like it as much as an A100 or an A150. And so the designer at that time for Boston Acoustics came into the store to sort of talk about the new speakers. And they had been out for a few years at this point, and he was there. Actually, they were talking about the Linfield project at this point. So they were talking about going this whole new ultra high-end Boston Acoustics project. And I took him aside as a speaker designer. I was like, talk to me, speaker designer to speaker designer, not manufacturer to retailer. And we got into a discussion, and he was like, yeah, no, the A's, I liked the A's better than the T's. Absolutely. They were better sounding. They measured better in a lot of ways, but market demanded that we make these narrower speakers. And so we had to do it. And they sold better in the market, and that was that. Snell is another one. We sold Snell, and the E3s. The Snell E3 was the last of the classic Peter Snell styled. I mean, I know the E3 was a Kevin Vex design, but it was very closely adhering to Peter Snell's original design, and it was a wide box. It was a 8-inch two-way speaker. And that speaker was phenomenal. For me, I sold 1 million Snell E3s working at Stereo Exchange back in 1982 or whenever, that was 1992, sorry, 1992, 1993. It was incredible, but all the new Snell designs were not like that. The Snell Ds, one step above the Cs, one step above the Es, were the Bs, sorry, this is upside down. There were Ds as well, but the Bs were narrow with side-mounted woofers, and they sold well, but I just never liked them nearly as much as those perfect sort of pure Snell Es. And so coming back around to what we were talking about, designing the orangutans, I was having flashbacks of all of these things that I already knew about that I had sort of forgotten over the years, because I was so concentrated on making speakers that were market friendly, which means narrow towers, but that had these sensitivity. And so I was hitting a ceiling in sensitivity with with the Gibbon 8 and the Super 8 and the Silverbacks. I was hitting a ceiling of as far as I could go because I was stuck with these narrow fronts. And so, yeah, the orangutans absolutely opened up a lot of things for me and allowed a lot of things to flow much more simply, much more beautifully in the designs. And within a year of being on the market, the 96 was our top selling speaker and is certainly the speaker that we're most well known for. And it has never not been the top selling speaker I think they're 12 years now. I think they're at least 11 years straight making that speaker. So it tells you about thinking that you can read the market and not, and also thinking that you need to limit yourself in terms of what the market will accept. That the first year of releasing the 096 on the market, it was tricky. My dealer network in the US was, let's just say it was 20 dealers. 5 dealers immediately ordered them. They were ecstatic. They were the dealers that had they had Shindo, and they had stuff that was very fussy about what speakers they could work with. And the Shindo speakers were big horn speakers. They were not practical and easy to set up in an everyday living room situation. And so these dealers immediately, they heard high impedance, they heard high sensitivity, they were like, give me those damn things faster, faster. But the other 15 dealers were like, I don't know, those are really retro. My customers don't like ye oldie sounding speakers. Why would they? So some of them were just like, all right, I'll try it. So another 5 dealers, so 10 of the dealers got the demos in, and they were loving them. They were selling them. Customers were coming in and reacting. What are those? Wife acceptance factor, was high on them. They loved the idea that I could put different veneers on the front faces. They loved the idea that they looked like sort of furniture. They were more living room friendly than these weird sort of high tech things. And then the other 10 dealers were just like, no, my customers will never ever buy that. And for those dealers, I had to just be like, look, buy them, and I will give you 100% credit back for a different model if they don't work, but just keep them for 6 months, make sure they're burned in. And nobody returned them. And at that point, they had been out there for a year, and they were my top seller, even at those very resistant dealers. And yeah, I mean, my imagining of the orangutan part of my dealer lineup, of my product lineup, was 10% of sales, and the 096s just obliterated all of those ideas right off the bat.
Are there any issues with using those with amplifiers that don't want to see a 10 ohm load? So 8 ohm or 4 ohm or whatnot?
Well, yes. The 096, just to keep using that since it's the real common denominator. Like with the Parasound story, the JC5, I would never recommend somebody who has a JC5 get 096s, or somebody with 096s get a JC5. I would recommend somebody get an A21, because that sounded fantastic. They're, Hagel, big, powerful, 200 watt per channel Hagel amps sound amazing on 096s. So yes, I have over the years absolutely found amplifiers that do not work well. Another one is the first watt SIT3. I was fascinated by the SIT transistors that Nelson Pass had made, and I just wanted to make sure that I had one of the amps with those in it. And so when the SIT3 was announced, and a friend of mine who has 093 said, "Oh, you got to get these, you got to get these, you got to get this amp, got to get this amp." So I got one. Nope. and Nelson will admit in a second that that amp is designed for 4 ohms. It's even into 8 ohms. It's not ideal. It doesn't come into its own until it's working into a more difficult load. It needs to be, it's like it needs its tap opened up wider. It needs to have more current flowing out of it. If you've got that, if you've got more resistance that it's pushing back, it does not sound good into any of the orangutans, even with load resistors, which is what somebody at the Pass Labs factory was like, "Oh no, just put a series load resistor in there, or a parallel load resistor in there, and it'll sound fine." No, it's not the same. And the amp sounds very good on Super 9s, but I'll bet it sounds better onto a 4 or 2 ohm load. So yeah, there are absolutely amps that don't like the high impedance, even tube amps, definitely. I mean, like a VTL, and I love the VTL amps. Some of the VTL amps are the best I have ever heard. Silverbacks and Gibbons. I really like those designs of the Luke and B's amps. But they are, they wind their output transformers with a single secondary, and those secondaries are optimized, so the output transformers in a tube amp, they're converting the load using the ratio of coils from the primary to the secondary. They're adjusting the load so that the high output impedance of the tube is able to drive the lower impedance of the speaker system. So essentially it's lowering the output impedance of the amplifier in order to be able to put power into the speaker load. So most tube output transformers have multiple secondaries. So they'll have a primary that's connected to the output tubes, whether it's push-pull or single-ended, doesn't matter. And then they'll have one secondary that has a ratio of windings that makes it optimized for a 16 ohm load speaker. They have another separate primary where the windings are optimized for 8 ohms, 4 ohms, or they may be like Macintosh amps may have like 8 ohm, 4 ohm, and 2 ohm secondaries. So that's the classic one, like Audio Research, for example, that their output transformers are like that. And those sound amazing on all of my models. I have a VT130 SE. I've heard the newer Audio Research amps, and you hook up an orangutan to the 16 ohm taps, awesome. You hook up a Gibbon to the 8 ohm taps, awesome. But there are some output transformers where they want to use all of the iron, and so they only have a single output secondary, and VTL is one of those companies, and that goes back to the original David Manley designs. And so those output transformers are optimized for 5 ohm loads. And Luke and B, they're famous for flawlessly driving Wilsons and Rockports in their showrooms, and they sound fantastic. So it makes sense for them to optimize for that load. And I've talked to Luke about this, and he's like, we've gotten so far as to I've come close to wanting to barter, because I love his amplifiers so much on like Gibbon 10s and Super 9s, that we've come close to bartering. And he's been really curious to get a pair of 096s at the factory so he can actually have engineers and himself just, you know, start listening to what I'm talking about when I tell him, look, it doesn't have the magic. So I've used VTL many times at hi-fi shows, but only like I debuted the Gibbon 10 with VTL amps, and it was stunning sounding. It sounded fantastic. So I've used them a number of times, but if I was doing a show and I was showing 96s or OREFs, I wouldn't want to use those because I know that they can sound better. I know that the amps can sound better, and I know that the speakers can sound better. So so yeah.
So 8 ohm taps are just fine for him, then it's close enough.
Yeah, if it's got if it's multi-tapped, then it should be just fine. Yeah, there shouldn't be any problem.
We have a few more questions here.
Go ahead, Ray.
This little different tact, in quotes, everyone says that speakers are designed to sound good on all music, yet does the speaker designer's taste in music influence how his speaker sounds?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a million. So I would even argue that not all speakers are designed to sound good on all music. I mean, you know, Dick Shahanian, you know, his speakers were designed to sound perfect with British orchestral classical. That's what he liked. That's what he listened to, and they sounded fantastic on that kind of music. But if you put a string trio on there, the violin was giant, and you know, it didn't sound right. You know, Amar Bose, he was a classical music guy, period. You know, he designed the Bose 901. Buy it or not, he designed the Bose 901 to imitate Boston Symphony Hall with a 90% reflectivity to direct sound idea. And to be fair, the best 901s would ever sound would be playing an orchestra. It would be playing orchestral music. It sounded more like being in a symphony hall than, you know, a system with a pair of LS35As, you know, it just did. But if you played rock, you would get, you know, singers with, you know, 20-foot diameter heads, and you would have, you know, nothing really worked as well. So it's like, so I would argue with the idea that speakers are designed for all kinds of music. That being said, some designers do honestly design for everything to sound right on them. Whether those are designers who, let's say, I'm not going to name names here, but there are a lot of very well-known designers out there who sort of, I wouldn't say they don't disregard the objective, they don't disregard subjective qualities, but their strong belief and probably their driving motivation in finishing a design is that if it measures within these specific parameters, then it's done and it'll sound fine on anything that you put into it. So that's an example of somebody who certainly believes that their speakers are going to work with any kind of music. And then me, my record collection, I mean, I can just move, you know, all four walls of this room have records on there. You know, my download collection is 10 terabytes currently. I listen to literally all kinds of music for pleasure, not because I have to be like, oh fuck, I have to listen to opera today because I'm designing the speakers and I have to make sure that I can claim that they sound good with opera. I'm listening to opera because I had amazing Italian food yesterday, and all of a sudden all I can think about is, you know, is La Traviata, right? It's like electronica, minimalist drones, pure ambient, you know, punk, horribly recorded punk on cassette. I love listening to that stuff. So yes, my speakers, in my opinion, my speakers absolutely work with all types of music. Within their limitations. So a little pair of like Gibbon 3s or even Gibbon 3XLs, slightly larger, they're not necessarily going to work as well with opera or with, you know, with like Wagnerian opera or with hardcore death metal. They're not going to work as well as a pair of 096s with that kind of music, simply because of the sheer amount of energy required to be put into the room, in my opinion, to be put out into the room for that music to actually kind of do what it's intended to do. There are a lot of people with mini monitors that love metal, and they do it in their system, and maybe it's a near field system, maybe they're getting a lot of bass boost from close proximity, whatever it is, and that's fine. They can definitely still work in that situation. But yes, there are speakers that are only designed for some genres, and yes, there are speakers that are definitely designed for all genres, and it is possible for speakers to work with all genres.
Great. Another question, what drivers do you use?
SFAF in Norway, they make all of our drivers, more or less. Some of the drivers, we build some of the parts here in the US and send them over there to get this final assembly. But SFAF does build all of our drivers, and they are all my designs. And that's been true since the very beginning. There were a couple of exceptions over the years. So the original Silverbacks, I designed a tweeter. Basically, I wanted the Dyne Audio D21 AF. It was an absolutely beautiful 3/4 inch, or you know, it was a 19 millimeter soft dome, textile dome tweeter. And I wanted a version of that. And at that point, Dyne Audio was not selling to OEM manufacturers anymore, other than a few manufacturers that they had already established in place. And at that point, I don't even know that they were still making the D21. And so I designed from scratch, and SFAF didn't really have any, you know, they didn't have the jigs to make that. So that was made for me by a different company, and we don't even use that tweeter anymore. That was the last speaker to use. That was the Gibbon 3XL. But everything since the new 19 millimeter dome, soft dome tweeter that is current, that is made for us by SFAF. They did make that one for us, and they're all my designs. And I'll give SFAF a plug. They make the best drivers. Their quality and their piece to piece consistency is, I mean, it's uncountably better than some very well established companies that I've dealt with over the years, and it is at least somewhat better than everyone else I have ever had experience with. They're awesome. They do a really good job. Actually, no, there was another woofer. The original Gibbon 3 woofer was made for me by VIFA. And when VIFA was bought by Timpani, and when they moved everything to China, they were not able to make that driver in the same way. They couldn't. They kept on making samples, and they weren't. I ended up having to discontinue that speaker, because when I tried to get another company to make it, between the retooling and everything, you know, ScanSpeak was sort of a part of that company, and we're still in Denmark at that point. And so they would offer to make that driver for me, but the retooling and the driver would cost about 3 times as much as that woofer had been costing me already. And so I basically just had to discontinue that speaker way before I wanted to, because of that. So yeah, that was the other one that was made by another company.
Very good. I think we've gone through most of the questions. Maybe we can see if there's one more final. But we sure appreciate your time, and a very interesting discussion for sure.
Cool. That was my pleasure. Anyone else have anything?
Let's see. Fred wants to know bass reflex, bass resonance impedance.
So that's
So
not a
the
question.
impedance
but
can't
we can make
be
it, but-
flat through the bass resonance, can it?
No, but it goes up rather than down.
It goes way up.
It can go way up. Yeah, it depends. So the resonance, there's always going to be a system resonance, so there's every individual driver in the system has a resonance, but then that resonance is part of the tuning of the system, and then there's a system resonance.
But typically for the tweeter and the mid-range, those resonances are crossed out by the crossovers.
Right. Yeah.
But
Exactly.
but for the woofer, it's got to be there.
In the low frequency driver, the woofer is going to be in the passband for sure. Yes.
So when you talked about flat impedance, you were ignoring the bass resonance.
Yes. Yeah. Well, when I was talking about, so yes, by flat impedance, I mean like an 8 ohm driver. So the flattest impedance of any speaker I've ever made is actually probably the Gibbon 10. And the Gibbon 10 is those woofers it's a ported. It's a bass reflex alignment.
Okay, thanks.
And but in isolation, if you measure the impedance of those woofers, they do have the typical twin peak. So a bass reflex resonance is a combination of the woofers having a big single peak, and then that port tube grabbing the top of that peak and yanking it down. And so that's why you get those two peaks essentially. And
Right.
That's sort of a characteristic impedance of a bass reflex.
Okay, and your speakers have that obviously.
All of the speakers except for the Gibbon 10 and the Silverback reference, and that's because what I did is I blended the pass bands of the mid-range driver, it's a 3-way, and the woofers in a way that, so I intentionally tuned the woofers and the tuning of the Gibbon 10. So those twin woofers, the impedance of that isolated bass system is much higher. It's higher than 8 ohms, and it has fairly high peaks. But when you blend that into the system with everything else, namely the bottom of the passband of the mid-range, it actually flattens those peaks down. So if you look at the impedance of the Silverbacks or of the Gibbon 10s, it has bumps, but it doesn't really have those big peaks. And that's how I was able to make a real flat 8 ohm impedance.
Cool, thank you.
But if you, so that was part A. Part B, see, you invited a long-winded guy who has so many things that he wants to just sort of talk about. The other element of the system resonance in anything, not just a speaker, but literally any resonance, it has a quality factor. There's a Q factor of the resonance. And so the Q factor can be adjusted as well. So in broad terms, the Q factor, if you have a high Q factor, if the Q is high of a resonance peak, that means that the peak will be high, the peak will go way up, and then it will come way down, but it'll do so very quickly. So it'll be a very narrow, very high peak. A low Q resonance will have a lower peak. So it will have a lower peak in audio terms. It'll have a lower number of dB that peak reaches. but the peak will be flattened out, and the peak will happen over a much wider range of frequencies. So if you make a lower Q resonance in a system, whether it's a sealed box low Q system, you can get a system that has a lower peak. And the resonance is not just, it's not just an impedance peak, it's a system resonance. There's a ton of energy going on in a speaker system, in the cabinet and the drivers, everything is, it's like the maximum efficiency of the system is at that resonance. So a ton of shit is going on. And so the way you use the alignment of the cabinet with the resonances of the drivers, the way you tune that is the way you get bass. Number one, is the way you actually get extended bass out of the system. And number two is the way that bass is going to get out into the room. So my preference over the years, and again, this goes back to being higher sensitivity or lower sensitivity in room experience, is that a high Q, within reason, a high Q system resonance is better, higher sensitivity, than a low Q system. There's a lot of people that will say the opposite. They'll say that a low Q system is inherently more linear. The problem is it's more linear at the one frequency where the peak is, but it's far less linear above and below that in frequency response. So if you look at the time domain, it's the same thing. A Q happens in the time domain as well. If you look at the time domain of a very high Q resonance, it's going along all fine, and then boom, you have a high Q just out of nowhere, sharp cliff up, sharp cliff down, little bit of an overshoot, and then back down, and it's done. There's no trace of the resonance anymore. A low Q, which everyone, which these people, the low Q aficionados say is superior. A low Q is coming along, and then before the peak, it starts to go up, and then it hits its peak that doesn't go as high as the high Q peak, and then it comes down, and then it's still doing its thing for a certain measure of time after the thing. And so the Q of those peaks has a huge effect. So when the amplifier is looking at the load that the speaker is presenting, and you give it a very high peak, a high Q peak in the bass, as assuming that you're keeping impedances up, that high peak is it barely registers on the overall system impedance in terms of presenting a load to those output transformers. Whereas if you have a system with a very low Q peak, that it may be sort of a suppressed peak that ends up spreading out, then there's more change in impedance over a wider range of frequencies that the amplifier load is seeing. And so for me, it affects it more that way. It's one of the reasons why I don't think sealed boxes sound as good with tube amps in general. Certainly with high output impedance tube amps is partly because of that.
Let's wrap it up with one last question. What's on your design future? Is there any models you're looking at coming out?
The only thing that is really on the table right now is it's going to be the production version of the 20. So 2 years ago, it was the 20th anniversary of DeVore Fidelity. And so we made a limited edition speaker. We made 20 pairs, and it is essentially, it's kind of like an ultimate 096 in a way. So it's the cabinet is externally identical to an 096 cabinet, whereas the OREF is not. The OREF has the same front as a 096 cabinet, but the back is pointed. It has a smaller internal volume. It weighs more than twice as much as an 096. It's got a 2-inch thick front baffle. There's a lot of differences in there. So the 20s, it's literally it's an OREF tweeter. It's the OREF 1.1/8 dome tweeter. Completely everything about it is, it's literally everything is, including its machined bronze horn. And then the woofer is, it's essentially, it's an 096 woofer maxed out. So it's built on an OREF bronze chassis, and it has a couple of the little tricks from the OREF main driver without going all out and doing the Alnico motor and the individually machined pole pieces and all that stuff that makes the ref woofer so insane. So it's got the same ceramic ferrite magnet as the 096 on the back, but it does have the machined bronze phase plug, and it does have the copper ring and stuff like that from the ref. And it has the bronze ports, speaker ports in the back. So I made, and they all have a numbered 1 through 20. They have a numbered badge, bronze badge on the tops. So those sold out very quickly, but they essentially, getting the deposits and all that kind of stuff made it possible to, as I was so in the hole, I continue to be massively in the hole with the OREF project because of the expense of designing and pouring the bronze castings and getting them all machined and making samples and stuff like that. The bronze stuff was a huge expense making the OREFs happen. So I always knew I was going to use as many of those OREF bronze parts in future models as possible. So the 20 was the test case for that. And so each pair of 20s was completely made to order. So like a pair of OREFs, they're not built until the customer has decided, what kind of veneers they want, what kind of finishes they want, and all these kinds of things. And then we build them. And so they all had deposits up front, and those deposits up front are what paid for pouring the bronze for making this a production speaker in the future. So that, oh man, I am long-winded. So that's what's on the table right now, is making the production version of the 20, making that a reality. And then after that, I honestly have nothing. I mean, the micros and the O babies getting out to market, that was the big project recently, and that's it. And I mean, the speaker that's the longest in tooth is the 096, and it continues to be our top seller. I have absolutely nothing I want to do to that design. So yeah, nothing. The last speaker that was using the old parts, so the last speaker that was using the old silverback tweeter was the 3XL, and that's discontinued. So yeah, nothing right now, no projects beyond that. Other than expanding production and trying to catch up, dig out of the backwater situation. That's the main thing right now.
So
Very good.
we actually have one question I think is actually a pretty good one, and that is, how did you happen to name your speakers after the great apes?
Well, great and lesser apes. So gibbons are lesser apes, but
Yeah.
Yes, that's a question that I have answered over the many years. I have answered a million times, and the answers it's changed a few times over the years. So the one answer is that the speaker that inspired me starting the company, I called it the Gibbon speaker because it was fun. And it was this little two-way speaker that it was a commission for a friend of mine at the time, and he wanted me to build him a pair of really small little two-mount speakers. Little two-way stand mount speakers. And they were sort of fun to listen to and playful and all that. And I was just like, they're Gibbons, Gibbons are, Gibbons, they sing to each other. They're funny, they're silly, they play a lot. And so I named them Gibbons. I've always kind of loved them. My dad's older brother was a very prominent primatologist and anthropologist. So this sort of idea of primates in the house was always kind of, it was always something that was in my mind. So when I started the company, I really did technically used a lot of the stuff that I learned making those original Gibbon speakers. The Gibbon 3s were literally the third iteration of that speaker. So they were the Gibbon Mark III. They weren't the Gibbon 3s. They were that original speaker that I made for my friend in a Mark III version. So that's one of them. Orangutans came about, so silverbacks came about as the biggest, baddest ape of them all. And then the orangutans came about because designing them, when I realized it was going to be a 10-inch tube and it was going to be a big wide face, there you go, they're orangutans. Orangutans, the big alpha male orangutan has that huge, big, wide face. And so, but the other reason, and maybe almost the real reason that I started out calling things Gibbons was partly in the same way that I was trying to be serious at the same time as trying to be great sounding and well measuring at the same time as not being low impedance and difficult to drive. I wanted to be, serious and accepted at the same time as not taking myself too seriously and naming something the, ultimate reference Mark 7E signature, just kind of poking fun at all of that as well in a way that I think actually one of the best examples of that. I mean, so I named all mine after apes who throw shit at you if they don't like you, right? Dave Wilson did that too. I mean, it was hilarious. The wit, fine. It's the Wilson Audio Tiny Tot and the Wilson Audio modular monitor, but it was also the Wham, or the puppy. Those were funny. He was kind of making fun of the seriousness. So, hats off to him, for doing that. Hats off to him in so many ways, rest in peace. But in a lot of ways, his speaker designs were very different from my speaker designs. And obviously, talking about his designs from the 90s as being very difficult to drive is an easy one. But, he blazed the trail for all out assaults. He and sort of Arnie Nudell, they blazed the trail for all out assaults, sort of no holds barred, really just taking it to the limit kinds of designs. And they both proved that there was a market for a crazy pair of IRS 5s, out there, or the Whams again. I mean, that is a crazy system. But they showed everyone else that there's a market. And so, if you can conceive of it, fucking go for it, and if you can make a mag design that works, but has to cost $100,000, try it, do it, go for it. And yeah, I mean, without that, it would have been much harder. I mean, the OREF system, that kind of evolved. That was never intended to, it was never intended to be 4 pieces. It was never intended to be almost $90,000 ever. But, when I started getting into the bronze and I started getting into the Alnico, another one, Alnico, Dave Wilson, those last drivers that he designed, those mid-range drivers were Alnico. And, he's right. It just sounds better. It's expensive as hell and it's very limiting to use, but they are better. Mm-hmm. So, getting into that stuff, it made the price go up. And I realized at a certain point that at the price point that I was starting to reach, they had to be perfect, whatever. I mean, for me, perfect. And that's when it became a 4-piece system, and that's when it became what the OREF became. And you know, the OREFs literally came out right before COVID shut everything down. Some of you guys, actually, some of you in the San Francisco area, you know, the last time the refs were played in public was at Tim's store. I think he was the last stop we made on that little tour that I did with this literal pair of this set of OREFs here. And we did an in-store demo. It was awesome. I mean, it sounded great there. And the plan from then was to, you know, just get all the demo orders for all the stores together and, you know, build the first batch of OREFs. And then COVID shut everything down. I certainly wasn't going to pressure even the dealers that had made commitments. I was not going to pressure them to cough up that kind of money. And so the ref project was literally shelved for 2 years. And we've shipped a couple of pairs now, and we are currently building 6 sets for 6 orders currently right now. But right now there are only a couple of pairs out there in the world. And but they've kind of come back to life, and they're sort of going to get a rebirth. They're being reintroduced with no changes or anything like that, but they're finally going to get their shot. So yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. It's been immensely interesting and wonderful to have you spend your time with us.
Thanks
Yes,
very much. It was a huge honor. This was a lot of fun. Great questions. I mean, they were all really good questions that all had little elements of things that I like to talk about. So this was very easy. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you
John.
very
That
much.
was awesome.
Thanks, John.
Cheers.
If you're ever in the Bay Area, certainly let us know.
I will. Cool. Yeah. Thanks. And for
All right,
anyone, I
John.
don't see anyone on the screen anymore, but for anyone who's there that I know, you know, maybe John Hughes or I don't know, Wayne Pryor. I'm not sure who is a member who might not be out there, but hey, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Led Zeppelin rules, John. Led Zeppelin rules.
Absolutely. And they would approve, wouldn't they?
Thanks a lot, John.
All right. Thanks, guys.